Hello and welcome to the SDG Media Zone. We are live at the UN Ocean Conference here in Nice, France. I'm going to hand it over to the moderator, Leah Nakash, Communication Officer with the International Science Council, to start the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So in this session today, we're going to look at emerging ocean-based technology and human intervention, like deep sea mining and carbon dioxide removal, and the question they raise for science, policy, and society. Some of these interventions are being tested or rolled out with limited oversight, while their long-term impact on marine ecosystem and coastal communities remain poorly understood. Scientists have raised concern about major knowledge gap. We've heard it entire this week at the conference, and the risk of irreversible damage, especially in deep sea environment that we still know very little about. So in this session, we'll look at what science knows, what it doesn't, and how this intervention could affect ecosystem and communities, along with what's needed for a more informed and coordinated governance. As Martin introduced me, I'm Leah Nakash. I'm with the International Science Council. Briefly, the International Science Council, ISC for short, is an umbrella organization of over 250 scientific organizations. We work at the global level to convene scientific expertise, advice, and influence on issues of major concern for both science and society. We've been very involved here this week at UNOC. We've provided science-based input from our membership into the zero draft of the Nice Declaration through a dedicated expert group. And we have registered a large delegation of multidisciplinary scientists to attend UNOC. You can find more about us and our work at council.science. Today I'm joined with two experts. First we have Dr. Elisha Arud-Kolip. You're a lecturer in ecosystem governance and policy at the School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Science of the University of Melbourne, Australia. You're also a member of the Scientific Committee on Oceanics Research, SCORE, an IC-affiliated body. And with us we also have Dr. Peter Haugan. Peter, you're Policy Director, Institute of Marine Research of Norway. You're also professor at the Geophysical Institute of the University of Bergen, and you're also wearing your hat as co-chair of the International Science Council Expert Group on ocean. Thank you for joining me here today. So let's start with an overview. Let's paint the scene really. What are some of the new technology or human intervention being developed or tested in the ocean right now? And are there any that are still aren't getting enough attention from policymakers? Elisha, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. So when we think about the new emergent technologies or industries, one that's of great concern is deep sea mining. We're at a stage where there is technology, but that technology is looking to have huge and irreversible impacts on the deep sea. It's an issue that we've seen, thankfully, get quite a fair bit of attention over the last week here in Nice. But it is an issue that many policymakers around the world still don't really know about or aren't paying enough attention to. And so it's something that we certainly need to hear more about.
Thank you, Elisha. Peter, do you want to bring up something?
Yeah, I think, as you said, deep sea mining, we have attention here. But I think if I say the word marine carbon dioxide removal, I think many people wouldn't know what that is. And carbon dioxide removal is one of these marine geoengineering techniques or climate intervention, there's different names, things that people are contemplating in order to reduce the atmospheric pressure on the climate. And I think that sounds like a good thing. The ocean is already a very important climate regulator, taking up CO2 and much of the heat. So people are thinking about how can we increase that? How can we make it accept more CO2? But then how do we do that? We've heard, perhaps some have heard about some iron fertilization experiments that took place a decade or two ago. That was kind of not very successful in terms of taking up CO2. When we now mention things like ocean alkalinity enhancement, I'm sure nobody has heard about that. I mean, that's a word you don't even understand. So that has to do with changing the chemical composition of the seawater so that it is able to absorb more CO2. What are the side effects? How are we going to do that? Sprinkle stuff in the water that moves around. How is that going to affect ecosystems and fisheries and so on? Perhaps ocean alkalinity enhancement turns out to be possible. But then there are other things with direct ocean carbon removal, various techniques, and modifying things by, for example, growing kelp and then burying kelp in the deep sea. So all of these are on a very early stage. I would say the only sort of technique, if you want to call it that, or action that is being contemplated is restoration of what we call blue carbon. Blue carbon meaning mangrove, seagrass, salt marshes, and kelp that grows naturally along the coast. And I think that's the only one where people would agree that, yeah, you know, if we have lost some mangroves, we should really make sure we can try and get them back. Problem is, that's not going to solve the CO2 problem at the scale that we really need. So it's very different, that one, from the others.
Thank you. Some of these potential interventions sounds very heavy and potentially very risky. What kind of threats, do we know what kind of threats would this technology or intervention pose, and especially for marine ecosystem, biodiversity, and the well-being of coastal communities? Alicia?
Yeah, when we're talking about deep sea mining, we're talking about the collection of metallic nodules, sort of little potato-sized rocks on the seafloor. And so often that's sort of touted as being, well, we can just go along and pick up the nodules. That is not the way that it is done. If you think about going along the seafloor with a lawnmower, churns up the seafloor, we see plumes at the seafloor level. Organisms are picked up along with the nodules, but then we also have issues of plumes being released at either the surface level or mid-water levels, and those plumes can impact ecosystems throughout the water column. So when we're talking about the impacts of deep sea mining, we're not simply talking about even just these deep sea floor ecosystems, we're talking about impacts throughout the entire water column. And I'd like to build on what Peter was saying also in terms of these blue carbon interventions. It makes complete sense that we restore these blue carbon ecosystems, but we should be doing so because of their wonderful benefits that they provide to us, and not for the financial blue carbon credits. That should just be seen as an icing on the cake in terms of restoring these ecosystems.
Thank you. Yes, the economical argument is something that we've heard a lot about here in Nice. I'm thinking that unfortunately to move along with some of this restoration, we live in a world that needs to understand the economic benefits of restoring. So that's something that has been very much discussed here, and it felt maybe strange for scientists to hear such real take on the issue that you cover in your work. Peter, what would be the impact of carbon dioxide removal, for example? Because it's even less talked about than deep sea mining.
Yeah, well, you know, if you try to modify the ocean carbon ecosystem in order to modify its carbon uptake, that means that you actually change, you know, which fish eat which animals, which organisms, how are the plants growing, how do they die, where does it go? And again, that affects all the ocean water column. You know, the ocean, we talk about is a huge percentage of the world's area, and areas beyond national jurisdiction is 50% or so. But it's a much, much larger fraction of the living space on Earth. The ocean is 4,000 meters deep. We have organisms, distinct and different organisms at each of these depths. And they sometimes they migrate up and down. And so, you know, the deeper you go, the less we know. Some of the ecosystems on the seafloor are not driven by photosynthesis, which most of us learned in school, at least my age, that all life on Earth is driven by the sun. It's not true. We have something called chemosynthetic bacteria on the seafloor. The ecosystems are built in a different way. Life originated on this in the sea bottom, and there's organism classes that we don't even see on shore. So, I mean, the level of low understanding is almost incredible to people. We are land animals. We don't understand how the ocean works. We are interested, some of us, some are really diving and so on. But in order to figure that out, we need to understand much more. And again, we have zones. We have the deep sea. We have something called the mesopelagic zone, which is very, very sort of exotic animals and things that are happening there. We haven't mapped a fraction of that.
And can I just add also to that, one of the most exciting discoveries that's come out of deep sea research over the last few years is this thing called dark oxygen, which is actually the rocks, the same rocks that are wanting to be exploited by deep sea mining, actually produce oxygen, which completely changes the way we think about oxygen production on this planet. And so it's a super new discovery. We still don't know a lot about it. But there's the potential that that oxygen that those rocks are creating is super important to the ecosystems around them. So if we start collecting those rocks, we don't know really yet what impact we're going to be having on the deep sea. And so not only are we talking about sort of direct impact of picking up organisms from the deep sea and churning up the seafloor, but it's likely to have huge ramifications for ecosystems throughout the ocean.
Absolutely. A parallel that we've heard a lot here this week is that we know as little about the abyss, so the deep ocean, that we know about Mars, really. So that...
I think we know less, because there's much more life down there than on Earth. I think we know much less, actually.
So see, that's how high the stakes are here. And when we were discussing this session, Peter, you mentioned something also, the impact this intervention would have on coastal communities, because you're also an expert in fisheries, right?
Yeah, so many coastal communities in recent years have been sort of exposed to the new emerging and sounding nice, offshore wind is being built up. And I've been a proponent of offshore wind, for sure. It's one of the ways we can collect renewable energy from the ocean. But then again, the way in which that is done varies around the world. And if you go in and displace fissures, spawning grounds for important fish stocks, it creates a lot of disruptions. And for many people, not only the small-scale fissures around in developing countries, but also in our part of the world, in Europe, fishers have this is a way of life. It's their relationship to the ocean. It's much more than just a way to earn money. And that relates also to the things we are talking about when we talk about benefits from the ocean. Benefit sharing is a concept in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But those benefits are not only monetary benefits. It's actually cultural heritage, it's identity, it's the way in which many different groups, people groups around the world relate to the sea. And then we need to bring that into the equation when we decide how to act in the ocean.
It's something we've heard here, many delegations saying that we do not only benefit from the ocean, we are the ocean. Elisha, do you want to add something on this cultural heritage angle?
Yeah, so there are multiple different ways of relating to the ocean, and our current system of laws and governance doesn't do a very good job of acknowledging things like kin in the ocean. There are some communities that see whales as their kin. There are some communities that see the ocean as their ancestors. These are not things that are well considered in our current governance structures, especially when we're talking about things like deep sea mining. We do have a responsibility to take into consideration the common heritage of humankind. It's a legal responsibility to protect the common heritage, which is the seafloor. At the moment, that common heritage has basically been translated as a financial benefit. If we actually asked everyone in the world whether the financial benefit that they would get, which is probably not very much from deep sea mining, if we asked them all, well, would you rather see deep sea mining or the deep sea protected for you and future generations, I would hazard a guess that most people throughout the world would say, I would like to see the deep sea protected. And ultimately, that is the responsibility of states when thinking about the common heritage of humankind.
Thank you, Elisha. You mentioned governance. And on ocean governance, something that we've heard is that it's very fragmented. It's very complex. And in your view, what are the biggest gaps that need to be addressed, in governance, specifically in regard to this new intervention? Where do you see the biggest disconnect between science and governance currently?
Yeah, so the oceans, and particularly the open ocean or the high seas, is governed by quite a lot of different international instruments. So we have UNCLOS, or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is ultimately the governing framework for the oceans. But then we have many different either implementing agreements or other agreements, such as fisheries agreements. We have the deep sea mining agreement. We have dumping agreements, we have shipping agreements. So all of these come into play when we're deciding how any technology or industry should act in the oceans. And so when we're thinking about deep sea mining, the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, which governs the sea floor, really has a mandate to think about what happens in the sea floor. But then there are lots of other treaties or agreements which come into play when we're thinking about other areas of the ocean. So one of the really interesting questions around deep sea mining is what happens to fisheries that overlap with the impacts from deep sea mining. Who gets to actually decide whether it's okay for fisheries to be impacted or not? And as Peter was saying, those fisheries, people across the world rely on those fisheries. Fisheries are critical to food security for many developing coastal states and small island nations. So if we're not considering the broader impacts, and if they're not being considered across this sort of framework and this network of different agreements, then we're really failing society and failing humanity and the ocean in making those decisions.
Thank you, Alicia. And Peter, something that you highlighted is also that the governance is so fragmented that in between the surface of the ocean and the deep, it's not even being regulated by the same treaties.
Yeah, so this is the thing. I mean, she mentioned the Seabed Authority, which has the mandate to deal with minerals in the seafloor. But if you go 1 millimeter above the sea bottom, you know, there are other things that come into play. And how can you do anything on the seafloor without affecting 1 millimeter above the seafloor? So the thing that we really need to do, and this is a challenge for policymakers, but also to some extent for the scientific community, to make sure that we get these messages across and into the instruments. And I have one hope, and that is the new implementing agreement for the law of the sea, the so-called, it deals with areas, biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. This one, I think, has the potential to play this catalytic role of making sure that the others don't do harm. I mean, the principle is that you should delegate to the most relevant body to deal with individual questions. If they can do it, fine, but if they can't, then we need to have this bigger thing in. And also the fact that this has been negotiated over many, many years, and you know, we are now ready to fill it with content. But it's a critical step to fill it with the right content, to make sure that the science and technology that should underpin implementing is done in the right way, that we share all the knowledge, and that this happens in a good way. So I think I'd like to be optimistic on this front, but it requires a lot of dedication and trust and building and so on. And I think, you know, organizations like the International Science Council can actually play a role in mediating and making sure that we have all these things on the table. And then we need to have ocean literacy. People need to know. As we said, people have heard about deep sea mining, but the other things, how can we decide anything on that when people don't even know what it is? Shouldn't be done. Yeah.
And thank you for that answer, Peter. It's very true. And something I would like to conclude with, it's we've heard from President Macron at the start of the week. France is one of the countries really pushing for a moratorium on deep sea mining. And I think the latest number that 37 countries have relied those efforts. But when I hear you and I hear their efforts on governance, how does some states have decided to explore deep sea mining as an option? Or is this undermining this international effort, and is there any way we can promote accountability? I remember you saying, Peter, that there's an obligation to do no harm, even if you decide to proceed with deep sea mining in your national waters.
And then who gets to decide what is no harm and how do you define it, and make sure that you do it in the right way? I mean, I think the worst thing that can happen is that nations go unilaterally into the international waters. But it can also be bad if nations go unilaterally into their areas under national jurisdiction. First of all, it can impact the waters beyond their borders. But even so, I mean, it's still a question of dealing with your own waters in a way that respects also not only, you know, what the government in place this week wants to do, but actually respects all of these other things. And I come back to human rights. I think that is a key thing that we are seeing now in climate, and we are beginning just to see it in ocean, that we can bring in these human rights principles to make sure that we deal with this heritage in a better way than we have done.
Yeah, and countries have a legal obligation under international law to not transfer harm either to other areas of the ocean or to areas beyond their own jurisdiction. And so that's something that needs to be considered in terms of making any of these decisions. And ultimately, you talk about accountability. Accountability really comes when countries agree to and uphold the ideas of multilateralism. And at the moment, we do have a situation, particularly with deep sea mining, where we see the potential of countries going rogue. We've seen a company approaching the United States to try to apply for mining permits in international waters for deep sea mining, and it's looking like that will go ahead. And ultimately, that undermines the entire system of multilateralism and undermines accountability. And so what we need is we need countries agreeing to and adhering to those principles of multilateralism and the principles that all countries have signed up to in terms of international law, including not transferring harm.
It's very true. Thank you to both of you for joining us for this session, and let's hope that UNOC is going to be a turning point. You've said it, Peter. We're opportunistic. We've heard some critical issue being discussed today in a matter that never was. So there's reason to be hopeful, right?
Yeah, I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful. And I think ultimately, one of the things we could see countries doing as a result of UNOC is actually signing onto the moratorium in terms of deep sea mining and ratifying the BBNJ agreement. I think if we see countries doing those two things, we would be taking great strides to really protecting the ocean in the future.
And if I may add to that, there are options for bringing countries to court if they go too fast and do it wrongly. But let's hope we can avoid that. I mean, it's happened in one country that wants to do deep sea mining, brought to court, Norway. And this goes on. That's not the way to approach this. Let's be proactive and be positive, and then we can avoid having to use these kind of legal instruments to stop things which should never have started in the first place.
Thank you. And thank you for the SDG Media session for having us today.